Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at this video where we are going to be talking about Galatians chapters 1 and 2, where we saw in the previous video on the Galatians overview. You can divide Galatians into three nice, neat sections of 2 chapters each. And the first 2 chapters of justification by faith alone, defended, is what we're going to look at today in this video. And this is the overview of what we looked at previously. And we're going to look at chapters 1 and 2. And as Paul writes this letter, what we're going to see is he begins with his usual greeting in verses 1 through 5. But even as he gives this greeting, he's working to establish his authority as an apostle. And even that's going to be the overarching theme of these first 2 chapters as Paul is going to be addressing these Galatian churches that are facing false teaching. He's going to work to establish that he is an apostle by the authority of God, and the message that he came and proclaimed to them, justification by faith alone, that they are to look to Jesus and Jesus alone for their salvation. That is the message that he is going to work to establish by appealing to his own God-given authority. And so what we see in the first 5 verses is Paul introducing the letter, who he is writing to, and then in verses 6 through 10, very important verses, he is going to give the reason that he is writing the letter. And what prompted the letter was the Galatians' departure from the gospel. And usually in Paul's letters, he has something nice to say, right? Right after the greeting, there's some niceties of, hey, I've been praying for you, and I'm encouraged to hear how the Lord has been at work in your church. Paul doesn't go through any of that in this letter. He introduces the letter, and then he says, this is why I'm writing. I am astonished that you have abandoned the gospel so quickly, and you need to redirect and only accept what I have taught to you. So he writes what has prompted the letter, and he warns them not to accept any other gospel because there really is no other gospel. And so it's a very important section, and this is what kind of leads into the remainder of the whole book. There's this problem in the Galatian church, and Paul is writing to address it, and then he begins his explanation of where his gospel has come from and defending his authority as an apostle. So in the remainder of chapter 1, Paul gives us a lot of information about his personal testimony of how he came to faith in Christ on the road to Damascus and what he did after that, again establishing that he was called to be an apostle to the Gentiles and that he began to go and proclaim the gospel in Gentile areas. And then in chapter 2, Paul says he went up to Jerusalem and he spoke with the other apostles. That he went up and spoke to the other apostles, and he shared with them the gospel that he had been proclaiming. And it's exactly what all of them were proclaiming as well. Paul wasn't proclaiming a message different or slightly altered from what Peter and the other apostles were proclaiming. Paul was fully in line with everything that Christ had taught and commanded him to go and proclaim. And so Paul was accepted and approved by the other apostles, and so was his gospel. And then in chapter 2, verses 11 to 21, Paul gives additional evidence of his apostolic authority. And he says, this is the authority that I had. And he recounts an occasion where Peter and also Barnabas were rebuked by Paul. Paul gives this story of Peter refusing to eat with Gentiles because some other Jews came and began to rebuke him and address him and say, hey, you can't eat with Gentiles. So Peter shrunk back and he began to separate himself from the Gentile believers, and he began to say, I can't have in essence fellowship or participation with you. And Paul had to come and rebuke him and Barnabas and say, what are you doing? That the food that we eat and this of who we eat with, that doesn't do anything to justify us. We are justified by faith and faith alone. And Paul rebuked Peter and Barnabas, and that demonstrated the truth of his gospel and his authority as an apostle. And so Paul uses these first 2 chapters to establish his authority, to remind the Galatians, and remember, Paul went on his first missionary journey, and he started all of these churches that he's now writing to in this letter, churches in the southern portion of Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. Paul is writing to them to correct this theology and say, hey, understand the authority that I have, and this is the true gospel, what you accepted, and what he's going to begin chapter 3 with of, hey, what were you thinking? Who has bewitched you? Why would you depart from this? And so, but in these first 2 chapters, which we're reading this week, Paul is going to establish his own apostolic authority, and he is going to defend this gospel, this idea that we are saved, we are justified by faith and faith alone. And I pray that these first 2 chapters in Galatians will be both challenging and encouraging to you as you read them. Blessings upon you. Thanks for watching this video from Ambassador Bible Fellowship. We exist to glorify God by multiplying disciples, leaders, and churches who believe the gospel, grow in Christ, and go to the lost. If you would like more resources on the Bible, theology, and church history, you can hit the subscribe button below or visit our website at ambassadorbiblefellowship.org.